Chapter 7 Part 1 of The Worst Journey in the World, Volume 1, by Apsley Cherry-Garrard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7 The Winter Journey, Part 1. Ah, but a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? Robert Browning, Andrea del Sarto. To me, and to every one who has remained here, the result of this effort is the appeal it makes to our imagination, as one of the most gallant stories in polar history. That men should wander forth in the depth of a polar night, to face the most dismal cold and the fiercest gales in darkness, is something new. That they should have persisted in this effort in spite of every adversity for 5 full weeks is heroic. It makes a tale for our generation, which I hope may not be lost in the telling. Scott's Diary at Cape Evans. The following list of the Winter Journey sledge weights for 3 men is taken from the reckoning made by Bowers before we started. Expendable stores: Antarctic biscuit, 135 lbs. 3 cases for same, 12 lbs. Pemmican, 110 lbs. Butter, 21 lbs. Salt, 3 lbs. Tea, 4 lbs. Oil, 60 lbs. Spare parts for primus and matches, 2 lbs. Toilet paper, 2 lbs. Candles, 8 lbs. Packing, 5 lbs. Spirit, 8 lbs. Total, 370 lbs. Permanent weights, etc. 2 9-foot sledges, 41 lbs each, 82 lbs. 1 cooker complete, 13 lbs. 2 primus filled with oil, 8 lbs. 1 double tent complete, 35 lbs. 1 sledging shovel, 3½ lbs. 3 reindeer sleeping bags, 12 lbs each, 36 lbs. 3 eider-down sleeping bag linings, 4 lbs each, 12 lbs. 1 alpine rope, 5 lbs. 1 boatswain's bag containing repairing materials, and 1 bonser outfit containing repairing tools, 5 lbs. 3 personal bags, each containing 15 lbs spare clothing, etc., 45 lbs. Lamp box with knives, steel, etc., for seal and penguin, 21 lbs. Medical and scientific box, 40 lbs. 2 ice axes, 3 lbs each, 6 lbs. 3 man harnesses, 3 lbs. 3 portaging harnesses, 3 lbs. Cloth for making roof and door for stone igloo, 24 lbs. Instrument box, 7 lbs. 3 pairs of ski and sticks, discarded afterwards, 33 lbs. 1 pickaxe, 11 lbs. 3 crampons, 2 lbs 3 ounces each, 6½ lbs. 2 bamboos for measuring tide if possible, 14 feet each, 4 lbs. 2 male bamboos, 4 lbs. 1 plank to form top of door of igloo, 2 lbs. 1 bag sennegrass, 1 lb. 6 small female bamboo ends, and 1 knife for cutting snow block to make igloo, 4 lbs. Packing, 8 lbs. Total 420 lbs. Grand total 790 lbs. The lamp box mentioned above contained the following: 1 lamp for burning blubber, 1 lamp for burning spirit, 1 tent candle lamp, 1 blubber cooker, 1 blowpipe. The party of 3 men set out with a total weight of 757 lbs to draw, the ski and sticks in the above list being left behind at the last moment. It was impossible to load the total bulk upon 1 12-foot sledge, and so 2 9-foot sledges were taken, one toggled on behind the other. While this made the packing and handling of the gear much easier, it nearly doubled the friction surface against which the party had to pull. June 22nd, midwinter night. A hard night, clear, with a blue sky so deep that it looks black. The stars are steel points, the glaciers burnished silver. The snow rings and thuds to your footfall. The ice is cracking to the falling temperature, and the tide crack groans as the water rises. And over all, wave upon wave, fold upon fold. There hangs the curtain of the aurora. As you watch it fades away, and then quite suddenly a great beam flashes up and rushes to the zenith, an arch of palest green and orange, a tail of flaming gold. Again it falls, fading away into great searchlight beams, which rise behind the smoking crater of Mount Erebus, and again the spiritual veil is drawn. Here at the roaming loom of time I ply, and weave for God the garment thou seest him by. Inside the hut are orgies. We are all very merry, and indeed why not? The sun turns to come back to us to night, and such a day comes only once a year. After dinner we had to make speeches, but instead of making a speech, Bowers brought in a wonderful Christmas tree made of split bamboos and a ski stick, with feathers tied to the end of each branch, candles, sweets, preserved fruits, and the most absurd toys of which Bill was the owner. Titus got 3 things which pleased him immensely: a sponge, a whistle, and a pop gun, which went off when he pressed in the butt. For the rest of the evening he went round asking whether you were sweating. No. Yes, you are, he said, and wiped your face with the sponge. If you want to please me very much, you will fall down when I shoot you, he said to me, and then he went round shooting everybody. At intervals he blew the whistle. He danced the Lancers with Anton, and Anton, whose dancing puts that of the Russian ballet into the shade, continually apologized for not being able to do it well enough. Ponting gave a great lecture, with slides which he had made since we arrived, many of which Meares had coloured. When one of these came up, one of us would shout, "Who coloured that?" and another would cry, "Meares!" Then uproar. It was impossible for Ponting to speak. We had a milk punch, when Scott proposed the Eastern Party, and Clissold, the cook, proposed good old true milk. Titus blew away the ball of his gun. I blew it into the cerulean. How doth Homer have it? Cerulean azure, hence Erebus. As we turned in he said, "Cherry, are you responsible for your actions?" And when I said yes, he blew loudly on his whistle, and the last thing I remember was that he woke up Meares to ask him whether he was fancy free. It was a magnificent bust. 5 days later, and 3 men, one of whom at any rate is feeling a little frightened, stand panting and sweating out in McMurdo Sound. They have 2 sledges, one tied behind the other, and these sledges are piled high with sleeping bags and camping equipment. 6 weeks' provisions, and a venesta case full of scientific gear for pickling and preserving. In addition there is a pickaxe, ice axes, an alpine rope, a large piece of green Willesden canvas, and a bit of board. Scott's amazed remark when he saw our sledges 2 hours ago, "Bill, why are you taking all this oil?" pointing to the 6 cans lashed to the tray on the second sledge, had a bite in it. Our weights for such travelling are enormous, 253 pounds a man. It is midday, but it is pitchy dark, and it is not warm. As we rested my mind went back to a dusty, dingy office in Victoria Street, some 15 months ago. "I want you to come," said Wilson to me, and then, "I want to go to Cape Crozier in the winter and work out the embryology of the Emperor penguins, but I'm not saying much about it. It might never come off." Well, this was better than Victoria Street, where the doctors had nearly refused to let me go, because I could only see the people across the road as vague blobs walking. Then Bill went and had a talk with Scott about it, and they said I might come if I was prepared to take the additional risk. At that time I would have taken anything. After the depôt journey at Hut Point, walking over that beastly slippery sloping ice foot, which I always imagined would leave me some day in the sea, Bill asked me whether I would go with him, and who else for a third. There can have been little doubt whom we both wanted, and that evening Bowers had been asked. Of course he was mad to come, and here we were. "This winter travel is a new and bold venture," wrote Scott in the hut that night, "but the right men have gone to attempt it." I don't know. There never could have been any doubt about Bill and Birdie. Probably Lashly would have made the best third, but Bill had a prejudice against seamen for a journey like this. "They don't take enough care of themselves, and they will not look after their clothes." But Lashly was wonderful. If Scott had only taken a 4-man party and Lashly to the Pole! What is this venture? Why is the embryo of the Emperor penguin so important to science? And why should 3 sane and common sense explorers be sledging away on a winter's night to a cape which has only been visited before in daylight, and then with very great difficulty. I have explained more fully in the introduction to this book the knowledge the world possessed at this time of the Emperor penguin, mainly due to Wilson. But it is because the Emperor is probably the most primitive bird in existence that the working out of his embryology is so important. The embryo shows remains of the development of an animal in former ages and former states. It recapitulates its former lives. The embryo of an emperor may prove the missing link between birds and the reptiles from which birds have sprung. Only one rookery of emperor penguins had been found at this date, and this was on the sea ice inside a little bay of the Barrier Edge at Cape Crozier, which was guarded by miles of some of the biggest pressure in the Antarctic. Chicks had been found in September, and Wilson reckoned that the eggs must be laid in the beginning of July. And so we started just after midwinter on the weirdest bird's nesting expedition that has ever been or ever will be. But the sweat was freezing in our clothing and we moved on. All we could see was a black patch away to our left, which was Turk's Head. When this disappeared we knew that we had passed Glacier Tongue, which, unseen by us, eclipsed the rocks behind, and then we camped for lunch. That first camp only lives in my memory because it began our education of camp work in the dark. Had we now struck the blighting temperature which we were to meet? There was just enough wind to make us want to hurry. Down harness, each man to a strap on the sledge, quick with the floorcloth, the bags to hold it down, now a good spread with the bamboos, and the tent inner lining, hold them, Cherry, and over with the outer covering, snow onto the skirting, and inside with the cook with his candle and a box of matches. That is how we tied it. That is the way we were accustomed to do it, day after day and night after night, when the sun was still high, or at any rate only setting, sledging on the Barrier in spring and summer and the autumn, pulling our hands from our mitts when necessary, plenty of time to warm up afterwards, in the days when we took pride in getting our tea boiling within 20 minutes of throwing off our harness, when the man who wanted to work in his fur mitts was thought a bit too slow. But now it didn't work. "We shall have to go a bit slower," said Bill, and "we shall get more used to working in the dark." At this time I remember I was still trying to wear spectacles. We spent that night on the sea ice, finding that we were too far in towards Castle Rock, and it was not until the following afternoon that we reached and lunched at Hut Point. I speak of day and night, though they were much the same, and later on when we found that we could not get the work into a 24-hour day, we decided to carry on as though such a convention did not exist, as in actual fact it did not. We had already realized that cooking under these conditions would be a bad job, and that the usual arrangement by which one man was cook for the week would be intolerable. We settled to be cook alternately day by day. For food we brought only pemmican and biscuit and butter. For drink we had tea, and we drank hot water to turn in on. Pulling out from Hut Point that evening we brought along our heavy loads on the 2 9-foot sledges with comparative ease. It was the first, and though we did not know it then, the only bit of good pulling we were to have. Good pulling to the sledge traveller means easy pulling. Anyway, we went round Cape Armitage and eastward. We knew that the Barrier Edge was in front of us, and also that the break-up of the sea ice had left the face of it as a low perpendicular cliff. We had, therefore, to find a place where the snow had formed a drift. This we came right up against, and met quite suddenly a very keen wind flowing, as it always does, from the cold Barrier down to the comparatively warm sea ice. The temperature was -47° Fahrenheit, and I was a fool to take my hands out of my mitts to haul on the ropes to bring the sledges up. I started away from the Barrier Edge with all 10 fingers frostbitten. They did not really come back until we were in the tent for our night meal, and within a few hours there were 2 or 3 large blisters, up to 1 inch long, on all of them. For many days those blisters hurt frightfully. We were camped that night about half a mile in from the Barrier Edge. The temperature was -56°. We had a baddish time, being very glad to get out of our shivering bags next morning, June 29th. We began to suspect, as we knew only too well later, that the only good time of the 24 hours was breakfast, for then with reasonable luck we need not get into our sleeping bags again for another 17 hours. The horror of the 19 days it took us to travel from Cape Evans to Cape Crozier would have to be re-experienced to be appreciated, and any one would be a fool who went again. It is not possible to describe it. The weeks which followed them were comparative bliss. not because later our conditions were better, they were far worse, because we were callous. I for one had come to that point of suffering at which I did not really care if only I could die without much pain. They talk of the heroism of the dying. They little know. It would be so easy to die. A dose of morphia, a friendly crevasse, and blissful sleep. The trouble is to go on. It was the darkness that did it. I don't believe -70 temperatures would be bad in daylight, not comparatively bad, when you could see where you were going, where you were stepping, where the sledge straps were, the cooker, the primus, the food, could see your footsteps lately trodden deep into the soft snow that you might find your way back to the rest of your load, could see the lashings of the food bags, could read a compass without striking 3 or 4 different boxes to find one dry match, could read your watch to see if the blissful moment of getting out of your bag was come without groping in the snow all about, when it would not take you 5 minutes to lash up the door of the tent, and 5 hours to get started in the morning. But in these days we were never less than 4 hours from that moment when Bill cried "Time to get up" to the time when we got into our harness. It took 2 men to get 1 man into his harness, and was all they could do, for the canvas was frozen, and our clothes were frozen until sometimes not even 2 men could bend them into the required shape. The trouble is sweat and breath. I never knew before how much of the body's waste comes out through the pores of the skin. On the most bitter days, when we had to camp before we had done a 4-hour march in order to nurse back our frozen feet, it seemed that we must be sweating, and all this sweat, instead of passing away through the porous wool of our clothing and gradually drying off us, froze and accumulated. It passed just away from our flesh and then became ice. We shook plenty of snow and ice down from inside our trousers every time we changed our footgear, and we could have shaken it from our vests and from between our vests and shirts, but of course we could not strip to this extent. But when we got into our sleeping bags, if we were fortunate, we became warm enough during the night to thaw this ice. Part remained in our clothes, part passed into the skins of our sleeping bags, and soon both were sheets of armour plate. As for our breath, in the daytime it did nothing worse than cover the lower parts of our faces with ice and solder our balaclavas tightly to our heads. It was no good trying to get your balaclava off until you had had the primus going quite a long time, and then you could throw your breath about if you wished. The trouble really began in your sleeping bag, for it was far too cold to keep a hole open through which to breathe. So all night long our breath froze into the skins, and our respiration became quicker and quicker as the air in our bags got fouler and fouler. It was never possible to make a match strike or burn inside our bags. Of course we were not iced up all at once. It took several days of this kind of thing before we really got into big difficulties on this score. It was not until I got out of the tent one morning, fully ready to pack the sledge, that I realized the possibilities ahead. We had had our breakfast, struggled into our footgear, and squared up inside the tent, which was comparatively warm. Once outside, I raised my head to look round and found I could not move it back. My clothing had frozen hard as I stood, perhaps 15 seconds. For 4 hours I had to pull with my head stuck up, and from that time we all took care to bend down into a pulling position before being frozen in. By now we had realized that we must reverse the usual sledging routine and do everything slowly, wearing when possible the fur mitts which fitted over our woollen mitts, and always stopping whatever we were doing directly we felt that any part of us was getting frozen, until the circulation was restored. Henceforward it was common for one or other of us to leave the other 2 to continue the camp work while he stamped about in the snow, beat his arms, or nursed some exposed part. But we could not restore the circulation of our feet like this. The only way then was to camp and get some hot water into ourselves before we took our footgear off. The difficulty was to know whether our feet were frozen or not, for the only thing we knew for certain was that we had lost all feeling in them. Wilson's knowledge as a doctor came in here. Many a time he had to decide from our descriptions of our feet whether to camp or to go on for another hour. A wrong decision meant disaster, for if one of us had been crippled the whole party would have been placed in great difficulties. Probably we should all have died. On June 29th the temperature was -50° all day, and there was sometimes a light breeze which was inclined to frostbite our faces and hands. Owing to the weight of our two sledges and the bad surface, our pace was not more than a slow and very heavy plod. At our lunch camp Wilson had the heel and sole of one foot frostbitten, and I had two big toes. Bowers was never worried by frostbitten feet. That night was very cold, the temperature falling to -66°, and it was -55 at breakfast on June 30th. We had not shipped the eider-down linings to our sleeping bags in order to keep them dry as long as possible. My own fur bag was too big for me, and throughout this journey was more difficult to thaw out than the other two. On the other hand, it never split, as did Bill's. We were now getting into that cold bay which lies between the Hut Point Peninsula and Terror Point. It was known from old Discovery days that the Barrier winds are deflected from this area, pouring out into McMurdo Sound behind us, and into the Ross Sea at Cape Crozier in front. In consequence of the lack of high winds, the surface of the snow is never swept and hardened and polished as elsewhere. It was now a mass of the hardest and smallest snow crystals, to pull through which in cold temperatures was just like pulling through sand. I have spoken elsewhere of barrier surfaces, and how, when the cold is very great, sledge runners cannot melt the crystal points, but only advance by rolling them over and over upon one another. That was the surface we met on this journey, and in soft snow the effect is accentuated. Our feet were sinking deep at every step. And so, when we tried to start on June 30th, we found we could not move both sledges together. There was nothing for it but to take one on at a time and come back for the other. This has often been done in daylight, when the only risks run are those of blizzards, which may spring up suddenly and obliterate tracks. Now in darkness it was more complicated. From 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. there was enough light to see the big holes made by our feet, and we took on one sledge, trudged back in our tracks and brought on the second. Bowers used to toggle and untoggle our harnesses when we changed sledges. Of course in this relay work we covered 3 miles in a distance for every 1 mile forward, and even the single sledges were very hard pulling. When we lunched the temperature was -61°. After lunch the little light had gone, and we carried a naked lighted candle back with us when we went to find our second sledge. It was the weirdest kind of procession: 3 frozen men and a little pool of light. Generally we steered by Jupiter, and I never see him now without recalling his friendship in those days. We were very silent. It was not very easy to talk, but sledging is always a silent business. I remember a long discussion which began just now about cold snaps. Was this the normal condition of the Barrier, or was it a cold snap? What constituted a cold snap? The discussion lasted about a week. Do things slowly, always slowly. That was the burden of Wilson's leadership. And every now and then the question, "Shall we go on?" and the answer, "Yes." "I think we are all right as long as our appetites are good," said Bill. Always patient, self-possessed, unruffled, he was the only man on earth, as I believe, who could have led this journey. End of chapter 7, part 1.